No living soul could stand to look at it for long. The house, standing alone on a hill, seemed to have grown out of the ground, but it looked alien, like a fragment of another reality. Its dark windows, like empty eyes, stared into the distance, and the roof, crowned with spires, resembled hands stretched out to the sky. According to human legends, it had stood there for over 100 years. Its walls, made of rough stone, held firm, although time had left its scars on them. No owner had lived in it for long, no family had stayed there for more than a few months. It was said that at night footsteps could be heard in the house, not loud, uncertain, but quiet, cautious, as if someone did not want to be noticed. The last resident was a man named Ivan Sokolov. He was a librarian from a small town, but he had always been attracted by old books, legends, and unusual stories. Hearing about the house on the hill, Ivan decided to settle there, although the locals discouraged him. "That house is cursed," whispered an elderly woman in the market. "Everyone who lived there disappeared or lost their minds." "Say that again, but louder," Ivan replied with a smile. "I like good horror stories." But as he crossed the old iron fence and stepped into the courtyard, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air here was different, thick, heavy, with a metallic taste. He stopped in front of a massive door covered in faded carvings. A sign was carved on the door, something between an eye and a circle. "Excellent," Ivan muttered, taking out the key. He entered the house, and the door closed behind him with a loud creak, as if the sound had been waiting for decades to awaken the silence. The house was unusually clean inside. The furniture stood in its place, as if someone had dusted it only yesterday. On the walls hung old portraits, which Ivan examined with interest, until he noticed one strange thing. It seemed that the eyes of the people in the portraits were changing their direction, following him. "A play of light," he said quietly to himself, although there was anxiety in his voice. He spent the first night in his study, unpacking books. The candle he had lit flickered, creating ghostly shadows on the walls. They moved with the fire, but one of the shadows seemed slower, as if it was lagging behind the others. Deep down, Ivan felt that he was not alone in this house. The first days in the house were unsettling, but Ivan held on. He decided to ignore the strange sounds that came at night, a soft rustling, like the rustling of leaves, although there were no trees on the hill, or a faint creaking, as if an old clock was trying to start by itself. The next evening, he heard a heavy thud, as if something had fallen on the attic floor. Sighing, Ivan took his lantern and started up the narrow stairs. The wooden steps creaked under his feet so loudly that it seemed to announce his approach to something hidden above. It was cold in the attic, although it was a warm autumn outside. Dust lay thickly, and the smell of mold hung in the air. Ivan illuminated the room with his lantern. His gaze fell on an ancient chest that stood in the very center of the room. "So we've found the source of the noise," he muttered, crouching down in front of the chest. The lid of the chest was half open, and inside he saw old papers, yellowed by time. Taking the first one, Ivan saw that it was a diary. The entries were illegible, as if written by someone in a hurry, whose hands were shaking. October 24, 1923. They came again at night. I can hear their voices. They tell me to leave, but I know, if I leave, I will be gone. The windows cannot be opened. The doors are locked. Ivan felt a chill run down his spine. Who wrote this? And who or what was he afraid of? Swallowing his anxiety, he continued reading. With each line the text became more and more chaotic. October 27, 1923. They are here now, inside. I hear their footsteps, their whispers. They are looking at me through the mirrors. But most of all through that damn portrait. I see them, but I can't escape. When will it end? At the bottom of the page, instead of words, there were only deep scratches, as if from someone's nails. Portrait. Ivan repeated, remembering how he had been tingled by people's gazes at the paintings in the living room. Closing the chest, he went back downstairs. The same portraits hung on the walls, and now he noticed that they seemed slightly changed. On one of the faces there was a faint hint of a smile that had not been there before. On the other, the eyes seemed to have become darker. "My imagination is playing tricks on me," Ivan said aloud. But as he returned to his study, he stopped. On the mirror by the stairs, a thin finger had left a note scrawled across the fogged glass. "You're next." Ivan froze in place, staring at the words on the mirror. "You're next." They seemed to glow with a faint white glow in the dim light of the corridor. He rubbed his eyes, hoping it was just his imagination, but the writing did not disappear. "Someone is joking," he muttered. His voice seemed to himself dull and weak. Ivan was no coward, but with each passing moment his confidence weakened. He went to the mirror and touched the glass. It was cold, almost icy, although there were no drafts or open windows in the house. His fingers trembled, and he hastily pulled his hand away. "It's just an old mirror," Ivan convinced himself and went back to his study. He decided to distract himself by taking one of his books. But the pages no longer brought him peace. Every sound in the house made him shudder. Somewhere in the hallway, something tapped softly, as if a small bone had fallen on the wooden floor. He tried not to pay attention, but his imagination painted pictures of someone invisible walking nearby. As the clock struck midnight, Ivan heard a new sound. It was a light tapping that came from the living room, where the portraits hung. It was rhythmic, as if someone was tapping a finger on the wall. "You can go crazy like that," he said, getting up from his chair. The living room was dark, but the windows let in moonlight, which illuminated the faces in the portraits. They seemed even more real than before. Their eyes seemed to meet his as soon as he entered. The knock was repeated. This time it came from the portrait in the center of the wall. It was of a man in a black suit with a high collar. His eyes seemed almost alive. Ivan stepped closer. "What do you want?" he asked quietly, feeling foolish. And then something happened that he did not expect. The eyes on the portrait slowly, very slowly turned in his direction. It lasted only a moment, but Ivan felt his feet as if they were glued to the floor. His head was buzzing, and his heart was beating so hard that it seemed that if he had just a little longer, it would burst out. The knock repeated itself again, louder this time. The entire portrait began to vibrate, as if something was trying to break out. Then Ivan stepped back with a scream and saw a thick black liquid flow from the portrait frame. It dripped onto the floor, forming a puddle that moved towards him like a living being. Ivan rushed back into the corridor and closed the door behind him. He stood with his back against the door when he heard something laughing softly behind the wall. "You will not escape." This was not his imagination. The voice, deep and hoarse, came from right behind him. Ivan stood, holding onto the door, trying to calm his breathing. The laughter behind the door had died down, but the ringing in his ears continued. He had to run, to leave this house immediately, but his legs seemed to be refusing to obey. Fear filled his entire body, fettering his movements like chains of ice. Finally he forced himself to move away from the door. Opening it only a crack, he peered into the living room. It was quiet, too quiet. The portraits seemed motionless again, although the dark stain on the floor remained, spreading around. Ivan decided not to come any closer. He went to his bedroom, bolting the door and propping it up with a chair. "I'm safe here," he thought, although he didn't fully believe it. The night dragged on like an eternity. The sounds didn't stop, faint whispers, knocks, the creaking of old floors. At some point, Ivan fell asleep, although his sleep was disturbing and fragmentary. He dreamed that he was standing in the same living room, but instead of portraits, there were mirrors hanging on the walls. In each of them, his reflection was visible, but with terrible changes. His face was distorted, his eyes were empty, and his mouth was stretched in an inhuman grimace. Suddenly he woke up. The room was dark, but he immediately realized that something was wrong. Cold air enveloped him, and he heard a faint whisper. "They're almost there." He quickly turned on the table lamp, illuminating the room. Everything was in its place, but his heart told him, something was wrong here. Ivan heard the chair he was using to prop up the door slowly move. As if someone, on the other side of the door, was carefully pushing it. "Who's there?" he shouted, not hiding his panic. In response, there was a faint knock on the door. Once, twice, 3 times. Slowly, but persistently. Ivan approached the door, trying to peer into the crack. It was dark, but in its depths he saw an eye. It was unusually large, with a dark red iris, and it was looking straight at him. "Get out of here!" he shouted, backing away. The door suddenly began to shake, as if someone was pushing it with force from the other side. The chair fell, and the door began to open. Ivan saw a pale hand with long, crooked fingers appear in the crack. In desperation, he grabbed a heavy candlestick and threw it at the door. When the metal hit the wood, the door stopped, and the hand disappeared. Silence fell again. Ivan grabbed his phone, but there was no connection. "I have to get out of here," he thought, preparing to flee. But before he could do anything, the mirror in the bedroom dimmed, and an image appeared on its surface. It was Ivan himself, but he was standing not in the bedroom, but in the living room, in the middle of a pool of black liquid. His eyes were empty, and his hands were lowered, like a puppet's. "It's too late," whispered his reflected image, smiling a cold, inhuman smile. The mirror cracked, and darkness enveloped the room. The room was plunged into total darkness, and time seemed to stand still. Ivan felt himself cut off from reality, no light, no sound, only his rapid breathing and a heart that was beating so hard that it seemed it could burst his chest. Suddenly, 2 red lights lit up in the darkness. They were where the mirror had just stood. At first, Ivan thought they were some kind of lights, but he quickly realized that they were eyes. The eyes of someone who was watching him from behind the walls of this cursed house. The eyes were getting closer. Ivan felt something cold and wet touch his ankle. He jumped back, almost falling, and tried to find a way out. But the darkness seemed thick like smoke, and he couldn't even see the door. Then he heard a voice. A deep, hoarse whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "We've been waiting for you, Ivan. Who are you? What do you want?" he shouted into the void. There was no answer. But silhouettes began to emerge from the darkness. Tall, thin figures with long arms and heads that had no faces, only a void filled with blackness. They stood motionless, surrounding him like shadows that had come to life. Ivan, barely breathing, took a step back, and his hand came across something hard. It was a shard of a mirror, which he grabbed like a weapon. His hand trembled, but the instinct for survival prevailed over fear. One of the figures moved towards him. Its long arm reached forward, and its fingers looked like hooks capable of tearing flesh from bone. Ivan didn't think, he hit the twisted creature with a piece of mirror. It made a piercing sound, like metal scraping glass, and retreated. But that didn't stop the others. They began to approach from all sides. "No! You won't get me!" Ivan shouted and rushed forward, hoping to find some way out. The darkness began to crack. The world around him seemed unreal, as if everything that surrounded him was just an illusion, a curtain of fabric that was about to tear. Ivan ran out of the room, desperately searching for a way out. The corridor he found himself in looked different than before. The walls were covered in black slime that pulsed as if it were alive. But in the distance, amidst this unreality, he saw a door. The door was ajar, and a faint light could be seen behind it. Ivan ran, ignoring the screams and whispers coming from behind. When he reached the door, it suddenly began to close. Gathering all his strength, he rushed forward and literally fell over the threshold, finding himself outside. He lay on the cold ground, gasping for breath and not believing that he had managed to get out. The house stood before him, but it looked different. The windows glowed red, and thick darkness flowed from the door like smoke. Ivan felt something move in his hand. Opening his fingers, he saw a fragment of the mirror, which now pulsed with a faint light. "This is not the end," he said quietly, peering into the house. A wind rose behind him, and in its whisper he heard the words. "We will find you, Ivan. You are ours now." Ivan spent the rest of the night in his study, trying to convince himself that everything that was happening was just a play of his imagination. But even when dawn filled the room with a dim light, the feeling of someone else's presence did not disappear. The sun could barely see through the heavy curtains and dirty windows. Ivan, looking out the window, saw that the thick fog that had enveloped the house at night had not disappeared anywhere. In fact, it seemed to have become denser, as if cutting it off from the outside world. He decided to walk through the rooms to distract himself. Although in reality it was more like surveying the territory. Each room had its own character, as if the house was alive and wanted to tell him its stories. On the first floor was a dining room with a long oak table and antique chairs, each of which had a carved face on the back. It seemed to Ivan that the faces changed their expressions as he passed by. Next he came upon the library, a room that truly fascinated him. The shelves were filled with books, many of which looked extremely old and rare. One of the volumes caught his eye. The cover was made of leather, and on it was engraved the same symbol as on the door of the house, an eye inscribed in a circle. Ivan carefully took out the book. It was heavy and smelled of dampness and time. Opening it, he saw pages written in small text, but he could not read a single word. It was some incomprehensible language that resembled ancient runes. Suddenly his hand trembled, and the page turned on its own. He heard a faint whisper, as if someone were speaking the words right next to his ear. "He who touches knowledge cannot leave it." Ivan jumped back, dropping the book. It fell to the floor, and the room was filled with a deafening sound, as if something heavy had fallen into a bottomless pit. All the windows of the library shook at the same time, and books fell from the shelves. "Enough!" he shouted, running out of the room. His heart was pounding, but he tried to gather his thoughts. "It's the house that's playing with me. It wants to scare me." But something inside him had changed. The more he resisted this place, the more he felt that a part of him already belonged to the house. That evening, when Ivan turned on the lamp in his bedroom, he decided to do the one thing that had been calling him for a long time. Go to the basement. He had noticed the door to the basement the first day, but he had put off doing it every time. It was covered in a layer of dust, and the lock looked old and heavy. But now, feeling that the answer to all his questions was somewhere there, he gathered his strength and went downstairs. The key was found in a drawer near the entrance. He went to the door and, inserting the key in the lock, heard a faint click. The door slowly opened, and a cold breath of air hit his face. The stairs leading down were narrow and broken, and the darkness that came from below seemed alive. "Well," Ivan whispered. "If the house wants to scare me, let it try." And he began to descend. The stairs to the basement creaked under Ivan's weight, each step echoing in the thick darkness. The air grew colder and more humid. His lantern, which he held in his hand, cast a dim yellow beam, but it could not penetrate the darkness more than a few meters. When he reached the foot of the stairs, a large room opened up before him. The ceiling was low, the walls were covered with rough stones, and the floor resembled damp earth. There was a strange smell in the air, a mixture of rot, metal, and something unknown that caused a slight attack of nausea. In the center of the room stood a large stone table covered with an old cloth. On the table lay something covered with another cloth. Ivan cautiously approached, trying to ignore what seemed to be movement in the corners of the room. He reached out to remove the cloth, but stopped. In the silence, a faint sound was heard: breathing. It was hoarse and uneven, as if someone was trying to hide their presence but couldn't quite hold their breath. "Who's there?" Ivan asked, trying to hide his fear. There was no answer. But the sound of breathing came closer, and it seemed to him that it came from under the cloth on the table. "You wanted to see it yourself," he thought, forcing himself to gather courage. Ivan abruptly threw off the cloth. Under it lay something that could not be described in ordinary words. It was a creature that looked like a human, but its body was twisted, as if twisted by invisible hands. Its skin was pale, almost transparent, and its eyes were completely black, like holes in the void. It did not move, but its mouth was open, as if frozen in a scream. Ivan recoiled, but immediately noticed that one of the creature's arms was stretched forward. In her palm she held a small metal object, an amulet in the shape of an eye inscribed in a circle. With a trembling hand, he took the amulet. As his fingers touched the metal, the room around him shuddered. The stone walls seemed to come to life, faces began to appear from them, screaming silently, and the floor beneath his feet trembled. "Take it," whispered a voice that came from all sides at once. "Take what?" Ivan shouted, trying to shout over the chaos. But the answer came not in words, but in a vision. Memories appeared before his eyes, not of him, but of the house. He saw how this house had been built, how people had come here with hope, but had stayed forever, disappearing into the darkness. He saw the rituals that had been performed in the basement, and he realized that the amulet was the key. The key to something old and terrible that lay deep beneath this house. The room shook again, and a thick black liquid began to seep out from under the ground, reaching for Ivan as if it were alive. Without thinking, he rushed to the stairs, holding the amulet in his hand. The darkness chased after him, reaching out with long black fingers that almost touched his heels. Running upstairs, he slammed the basement door shut with force and leaned against it, trying to hold on. The liquid from the other side hit the door, but did not break through it. Then everything was quiet. Ivan stood, panting, holding the amulet. He realized that he was now bound to this house forever. "What have I awakened?" he whispered, looking at the amulet in his hand. In response, a faint whisper was heard again in the house. "That which never sleeps." The house was silent, but not still. It was a silence that hid the echoes of past events. Ivan remained sitting by the cellar door, clutching the amulet, which now seemed hot, as if alive. His mind was torn between the desire to escape and the need to understand what he had gotten himself into. The world outside the window seemed distant. He could no longer see the horizon, for the fog now covered everything around the house. Ivan felt that this fog was not a natural phenomenon. It seemed to protect the house, isolating it from the real world. "I must learn more," he thought. Ivan headed for the library, where he had earlier found the book with the eye symbol. When he entered the room, the shelves were just as he had left them, many books lying on the floor after the room had come to life. What caught his attention was not the book, but the painting hanging on the wall above the fireplace. It was a picture of the same house, but it looked different in the painting. In the painting, the house stood among lush green fields, under a bright blue sky. But if you looked closely, you could see the small details, the figures of people at the entrance, their heads bowed, as if in prayer. Ivan came closer and saw that one of the people was holding something in his hand. He leaned closer, and his heart beat faster. It was an amulet, exactly the same as his own. The painting seemed to come to life. The eyes of the people in it slowly rose, meeting his gaze. He flinched, but could not tear himself away from the painting. Voices began to sound in his head, quiet and piercing. "You have the key. Open the door." "What door?" he whispered, feeling the voices fill his mind. Then his hand, of its own accord, reached for the amulet. He suddenly understood, the house did not simply lock something in its walls. It was a portal. And the amulet was the key. Ivan picked up the book with the eye sign. It opened by itself, the pages quickly turned until they stopped at a picture, a round stone opening, similar to an ancient altar, and above it hung an amulet. Under the picture were the words, "Open the door and bring dawn or darkness, depending on what you choose." He understood, somewhere in this house there was that same round opening. Ivan knew that he had to find it. The path to the heart of the house. Returning the book to its place, he remembered the old tower, which was the highest point of the house. He had noticed the door to the tower on the first day, but then he did not pay attention to them. Taking the amulet and the candle, Ivan began to climb the spiral staircase that led upstairs. Each step echoed off the walls, as if the house were listening intently to where he was going. At the top of the stairs was a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. It had no conventional lock, but in the center of the door was a cutout in the shape of an eye. Ivan inserted the amulet into the cutout and heard a loud creaking sound, as if the walls of the house themselves had sighed. The door opened, and a small circular space opened before him. In the center of the room was the same fireplace opening he had seen in the book. The floor was paved with symbols that glowed with a faint green light. Above the opening in the air hung an amulet, exactly like the one in his hand. "This is a trap," he thought, but his feet carried him forward on their own. He stood before the opening and felt the house waiting for his decision. The amulet in his hand felt heavy, and the voices in his head whispered insistently, "Open it, or leave this place forever." Ivan took a deep breath. He had a feeling that after this choice there would be no turning back. Ivan looked at the amulet in his hand. His every movement caused an invisible reaction in the walls of the house. They trembled, whispered, like living creatures, feeling how he was approaching a critical point. Time seemed to slow down, and he felt that this was the moment that this entire house had been waiting for. Before him stood a ruptured abyss, promising either salvation or catastrophe. The amulet weighed heavily in his hand, pulsing with cold energy, as if trying to penetrate his very soul. He remembered the old legends that he had once heard from the locals. Anyone who came into contact with the house on the hill remained either lost or subject to its power. Ivan looked at the opening, which now looked not like just a cutout, but like a real portal. The glow from its edges beckoned. The moment when he had to choose, open or close the door, chose it herself. Ivan inserted the amulet into the center of the opening, and it was as if he had inserted the key into a huge, locked, crude time machine. At first nothing happened, but then the walls began to vibrate, the air froze, and the light disappeared for a moment. Suddenly a crack appeared in space, like a mirror that had cracked. Through it began to break through terrible, dark figures, similar to people, but with completely alien features, sparkling in the darkness. They were faceless, but Ivan felt their eyes, as if they were looking straight into his soul. His hands trembled, and a short cry escaped from his throat. Those figures, which at first seemed disembodied, began to approach. Each of their steps was the language of darkness, wanting to engulf and destroy him. Ivan felt a cold wave of horror sweep through his body, but he still held the amulet. "What is this?" he shouted. The voice in his head answered, almost a whisper, but one that shook his entire being. "These are your fears, Ivan. There is always a choice." Ivan's vision became blurry, and an incredible darkness woke up around his consciousness. Everything was too fast, and he did not have time to notice how silhouettes began to form around him. They were not people, but something much larger and more ancient, seeking to destroy any thought of hope. Ivan turned to the portal again, with deep despair in his heart. This was no longer just a test. This was a fight for his soul. He was not prepared for what began to happen. His voice woke up again, and it no longer seemed that it was he who was speaking. Gradually, all the silhouettes began to melt in the air, and he himself heard a dull voice that seemed to tear reality apart. "The one who will pass through this will be chosen. I am darkness and light, your right is to choose." Ivan took a step forward, rolled up the amulet in his hands, and suddenly the space around him changed. All the images, horrors, and figures dimmed and began to dissolve into dust, and instead a world appeared. Bright, but very cold. Everything around became clear, but so unfriendly cold that it became even more terrifying. Ivan, having no choice, lowered his head, and in a moment he found himself in front of a different, old form of the house, which no longer stood on the hill, but in the heart of this dark space, as if torn from reality. Now you are chosen, Ivan. Stay, or wander forever in the shadows. Ivan couldn't tell if he was hearing voices or if it was just his imagination. He knew one thing: this house was no longer just a place. It was cursed, and its story had only just begun for him. Ivan stood on the threshold of a new world, feeling an invisible weight of invisible forces enveloping him, holding him on the edge of two realities. Around him was a world that resembled old dreams, intertwined with terrible fears and hazy images. Much was incomprehensible and difficult to perceive, but one thing became clear: he was no longer simply looking for answers. He had become part of something much larger. The darkness began to recede, but not by his will. It was giving way to a new reality, and it was more than just light. It was like discovering something long forgotten, but for him it did not matter. He felt that he could no longer go back. "What happened to me?" he whispered, looking at the old house that now stood before him in a different form. Its walls seemed flexible, as if alive, rotating around him, changing their appearance like ghostly contours. He felt the forces begin to gradually pull him into the very depths of this place, and he was both the one seeking answers and the one becoming a part of them. Ivan looked up at the sky. It was no longer the way he knew it. The sky seemed to be split, with countless stars that had no light, and with thick clouds that absorbed every ray. Like in an old nightmare, where the sun shone, but it was cold and alien. Then he heard something. At first a faint, barely audible whisper, and then voices. They sounded again, but now they were no longer the voices of people. It was a dark force that barely contained its joy. It spoke as if everything had been determined long before his arrival. "You are the chosen one. You have crossed the threshold. Now we are together." Ivan glanced at the amulet that he still clutched in his hands. He was no longer just an object, he was a part of this world, a part of it, and in that moment Ivan realized that the amulet was only the beginning. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice hollow, like a great empty hall. The voice in response was quiet but clear. "You must pass through this portal. Only then will you gain the power that will allow you to rule this world." Ivan did not answer. He began to move forward, realizing that he no longer had a choice. The sky had changed again, and now he stood on the threshold of a huge arch made of stone and rusty metal elements, from which a liquid flowed, shining in the darkness. "The steps are heavier, but you feel their importance, Ivan. It is all you could do." Ivan took another step, and suddenly felt the ground beneath his feet become soft as wax. He looked down and saw silhouettes emerging from the darkness. They were the same shadows he had encountered before, but now they were larger, more powerful. Step by step, Ivan approached this portal, something completely unfamiliar. Realizing that this was no longer just a choice between life and death, he deepened into the darkness, feeling it with every step he took. And now he reached the arch. The portal opened before him, and Ivan took the last step. At the very moment he crossed the threshold, the world changed. What had been before disappeared, and in its place appeared a place that was like something out of a dream, gloomy but beautiful and dangerous. Ivan felt himself becoming a part of this world, and now there was no way back. Ivan stood on the threshold of a new world, and his whole appearance no longer resembled that librarian who had come here from an ordinary town. Something had changed in him, something dark and ancient that lived in the shadow of this house, permeating every cell of his being. He had become a part of this place, and this place had become a part of him. From the moment he crossed the threshold of the portal, his gaze had been directed only forward. Before him stretched a landscape that looked like a combination of different worlds. The clouds hung low, not moving, and the ground was covered with cracks, from which a soft but eerie light emanated. The air was cool, but it did not bring relief. Instead, it resembled something oppressive, hostile. The feeling was as if he had found himself in a place where time had no power. In the distance, in the fog, an old castle could be seen, standing like the last outpost on the edge of realities. Its walls were covered with moss, but they seemed as strong as ever. Ivan felt this castle pulling him towards it. The closer he walked towards it, the less he understood why he had really come here. He did not know how much time had passed since his feet had first set foot on the soil of this world. Each of his steps echoed in this space that seemed endless. And then, as he approached the castle, two entities appeared before him, tall and dark, their faces hidden by hoods. They looked at him without emotion, but Ivan felt their gaze penetrate him, as if they saw everything, all his weaknesses, all his fears. "Greetings, Chosen One," one of them said in a voice that was both dull and harsh, as if it had emerged from the depths of the earth. "You did not end up here by chance. You came to become what this world needs." Ivan held his breath. It was hard for him to speak, but he couldn't help but ask. "What is this place? And who are you?" "This is a place between worlds," the second answered, his voice like the rustling of old books. "We are servants of the dark forces, those who guard the transition between realities. You will not return, Ivan. You are part of this world. And from now on you will be one of us." Ivan felt his heart race. He knew it was inevitable. Now he was not just a man seeking answers, he had become part of what people feared. But why him? I don't want to be part of this world," he cried, his voice breaking, but he couldn't stop the urge. "You can't escape fate," the first of them answered, his gaze unwavering. "You have made your choice, Ivan. This castle, this world, all of this is your reality now. If you want to survive, you must accept it." Ivan raised his head and looked at the castle. He was ready. He had no choice. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, and the castle doors opened before him. The feeling he got was like the night suddenly parting during a storm, and light penetrated the darkness. The castle was dark inside, but as if every shadow hid some secret. He stepped over the threshold and saw them. Ivan stopped. In the shadows of the corridors stood figures that were not people, but were not shadows either. They looked at him, and each of their glances was like a magnet, drawing in all his will. "You are ours now," said one of the figures, her voice echoing in the space, filling every corner of this dark reality. Ivan felt his hand begin to tremble. A few more steps, and he would become a part of this world forever. But he no longer had any doubts. He had walked this path. There was only one thing left, to become what he was meant to be in this world, a being with the power to change everything around him. Ivan stood before them, before figures that were neither human nor shadow. They could feel his fear, but he could feel their power, coursing through his body, making every cell tremble with excitement. It seemed as if they had always been here in the darkness of the castle, in the depths of this other reality, in a place where time no longer mattered. They were eternal, and he was part of their world. "You chose us, Ivan," one of them said, his face dissolving in the shadows, as if it were only a reflection in a dark mirror. "You have become what we want you to be." Ivan did not answer. His thoughts were scattered, and all that remained was to understand that his new reality no longer had anything to do with the life he knew. Everything had changed. He clenched his fists. He was ready for anything, even to face those who would break him. "What do they want from me?" he asked, his voice firm, though inside he was still anxious. The figure standing to his right came closer. Her movements were smooth, silent, as if she were not touching the ground. She reached out her hand to his shoulder, and Ivan felt a chill that pierced his bones. "You must understand, Ivan," her voice echoed in the void. "This castle, this world is not just a place. It is a refuge for people like you. We give them the opportunity to become strong, to become what they want to be. But you will not return. And if you choose not to accept this, then this will be your final destination." Ivan felt a heavy burden fall on his heart. He could not simply retreat, could not return to his old life. Now that he had stepped here, that was no longer possible. This castle was not just a refuge, it was a gateway to another reality that devoured everything in its path. "Are you ready to pass the test?" Another figure asked, its eyes burning with cold light. "You can change this world, or it will change you." Ivan did not answer, but he felt that every cell of his body was screaming, "Yes." The old walls of the castle trembled, and the door to the great hall opened. The interior was dark, but in its depths a faint light shone, breaking out from cracks in the floor. The ceiling was high, and the walls were covered with ancient inscriptions that looked like evidence of past eras. Ivan stepped over the threshold, and the cold inside the castle seized him, as if this were another reality in which nothing remained. He walked to the center of the hall, not knowing whether he would reach the end or drown in the shadows. At that moment, a third figure appeared. She was taller than all of them, and her figure was wrapped in a dark mantle. Her face was hidden, but Ivan sensed that she was not like the others. There was something in her gaze that reminded him of his own desire for answers, but with a deep undertone of betrayal. "You came here willingly," her voice sounded like a whisper that reached the depths of the soul. "Now you must choose, either you want to become one of us, or you will embark on the path of oblivion." Ivan looked at her, feeling his heart beat faster. He had no time to think. "I am ready," he said, gritting his teeth. "What must I do?" The dark figure tilted its head. "You must pass through the dark circle, Ivan. This is your test. If you endure, you will receive the power you seek. If not, you will become part of this world forever." Ivan felt a cold sweat on his forehead. This was more than just a test. This was his final test. He approached the circle forming in the center of the room and realized, if he wanted to become what he was meant to be, he had to walk through this fire. And he stepped forward. Ivan stepped into the dark circle. The air around him became thick and cold, as if frozen at the very edge of time. He felt every step echo in him, as if this circle itself was tracking his every thought, his every move. As he stepped, he felt the silence press down on him, so heavy that it could break any will. The shadow on the floor began to change. At first it was just darkness creeping across the stone slabs, but gradually it began to take shape. These were the images of people who had once been here, and now their souls remained here, forgotten and lost. Ivan felt one of the images approaching him, a look full of pain and disappointment shone in the darkness. "You will not return again, Ivan," he heard a voice that seemed to be part of the circle itself. "It's your choice. You can move on, or you'll stay here, forgotten like everyone else." Ivan closed his eyes. All his doubts had dissipated, and he no longer felt fear. His heart beat evenly, and he was ready to meet his fate, because now he understood, nothing was holding him back in the old world. He had become a part of this place, and perhaps this was his destiny. "I'm ready." His voice was firm and calm. He looked up, and a path opened up before him, leading through a black corridor. His feet unconsciously stepped into the shadows, and he felt how each step shifted the space around him. The shadows on the walls began to move, turning into figures that became clearer and clearer. These were not just memories from the past, these were souls that had long since lost their human essence, but could not leave this place. He moved forward, and soon the corridor began to expand until it turned into a huge hall, crowned with high arches. It was dark here, but the light coming from the walls itself created a barely noticeable diffused glow, as if the house breathed with it. In the center of the hall stood a huge mirror. Its surface was dark, like a bottomless lake. Ivan approached it, and when his face was reflected in this mirror, he saw not only himself, but also a multitude of other people whom he could not recognize. These were people whom he had never seen, but they were all connected with him, and his gaze stopped on one, on himself, as he had been before he crossed the threshold of this house. But when he tried to look away, the reflection remained in place, like a cozy memory that did not want to leave. "This is your true essence, Ivan." A voice came from the mirror. It was not a stranger, nor was it a sign of that world. It was his voice, the voice he didn't want to hear. "You were always here, you were always a part of this place. Now that you've seen yourself, you'll understand that there's no going back. There's only one way forward." Ivan felt his heart clench. He couldn't deny it. Every moment, every step he took merged with this world, and there was no way back. "Yes." He uttered this word, and as soon as he said it, the mirror shattered into pieces, and a new path opened up before him. A breach tore through the darkness, a light that seemed to come from within himself. Ivan, without hesitation, took a step forward. And as soon as his feet touched the ground of this new world, he realized he was no longer who he had been before. He had become a part of this reality, and all that remained was to open new horizons of this endless, dark epic. Ivan stepped through the shattered shards of the mirror, and that movement was his final decision. He could no longer turn back. Every step he took merged him with the darkness that surrounded this world, and everything around him changed. The air became richer, heavier, filled with whispers that seemed too close to be real. There was noise everywhere, as if the very walls of the castle had come alive, discussing his decision. He walked without looking back. The road ahead of him was foggy, as if the fog felt like a part of this place. Ivan realized that now he was not only part of the castle, but also part of something larger, something that had no boundaries, no beginning, no end. And suddenly the light changed. Time seemed to stand still, and everything around him fell silent, only a faint whisper remained, as if the smell of forgotten promises hung in the air. In the distance, through the darkness, other figures appeared. They were not walking, they stood in the shadows, their eyes shining like lanterns in the darkness, guiding Ivan forward. "You came here, Ivan," he heard a familiar voice, and turning around, he saw one of the figures standing among the others. Her face was hidden again, but her voice made him think. "And now your journey is just beginning." It was the same voice that Ivan had heard in the mirror. The same one that had asked him about the choice. Ivan understood that the choice was only part of the game that filled these walls. They did not give him the opportunity to turn back, because they had long ago made their choice for him. "What does it all mean?" Ivan asked. His voice did not sound desperate, but more calm, even somewhat relaxed. It seemed that he was no longer afraid, but he still did not understand what had happened. The figure dissolved into the fog, leaving only its echo. "This world demands more of you than you can imagine," said another voice, cold and distinctly ruthless. "This is not just a test. This is an opportunity." Ivan felt the ground beneath him begin to shift. The stone slabs he stood on began to move, opening before him, and he saw that within this world there were other paths, labyrinths, dark corridors that led to new territories. This was not just a place, it was a living, breathing organism that changed and adapted, responding to his every move. He took a step forward, and that step opened a new room, a great door that led to other worlds. Each of their thresholds was a promised test, a chance to change your essence, transform yourself, or leave everything as it is, plunging into the abyss. "The choice is yours," the voice answered again, but now it seemed weaker, more distant, as if part of some distant memory. "Do you want to open up new horizons for yourself, or will you stay here forever?" Ivan understood, every step forward would mean the loss of something important, but he could not stand still. He needed to find out what was hidden behind these dark doors. And he stepped over the threshold that spread out before him, again feeling his heart beat faster as his every movement led him into the deeper and darker spaces of this castle. It was a game, but now Ivan was playing with the whole world. Ivan stepped into a new world, and the ground beneath his feet changed at once. The stone slabs became soft, as if the soil had been pushed up from the depths of the earth to receive him. Everything around was dead silent, but in this silence there was a deep tension. The air became hot, it seemed that every breath required effort from him, as if he had swallowed a part of this place that was trying to swallow him again. His steps sounded in the void, and with each further movement it became darker. Now Ivan understood that his path had long been led out of this world. He was not just moving forward, he was moving along the thin line between reality and the abyss, between what was and what had been destroyed. A figure appeared again in a distant shadow, it was one of those he had seen before. She stood before him, and her face, though still in shadow, radiated a familiar feeling. It was a part of himself, his former self, something he had left behind. "Time does not exist here," the shadow said, its voice hollow, like an echo in an empty hall. "And time is only a moment that becomes eternity." Ivan stared at the figure, trying to understand what she meant. She smiled, but the smile was so cold that he felt its weight on him. "You have chosen a path, Ivan," she continued. "And now you, like us, live in an in-between world. A world without time. A world where everything that once was mixes with that which does not exist." Ivan tried to argue, but the words would not come. He felt his very being begin to be enveloped by the darkness of this place. The shadows were getting closer, seeming even more real, and each movement created new figures that reflected not only his thoughts, but also his fears. "But what awaits next?" he asked, his voice now like a whisper. "Where does this path lead?" The shadow took a step forward, and its face became a little clearer. It was his own face, but with some changes, almost indistinct, as if it was no longer his, but part of this world. Ivan felt horror awaken in him. He did not want to become part of this universe, but he was already too far to turn back. "You do not understand, Ivan," said the shadow. "This path leads you to yourself. All you are looking for is yourself. You are this castle, this world. And this choice, it is endless." The figure stepped back, and Ivan saw a new door that had appeared in the place where the corridor had just stood. The door looked like an old oak door, carved with symbols he had never seen before. He found it hard to believe that this door could lead to anything real, but he felt that it was the only way. Ivan approached the door, feeling a dark hand of unseen forces pulling him forward. He opened it, and a new space appeared before him, larger than he could imagine, with stretched horizons and grey skies. It was not just a castle, it was a whole worldwide void, where there was neither time nor space. He took the first step and realized that this was his path to infinity. "I am a part of this," he whispered, and each word crumbled into the void, becoming a part of this world. Ivan did not know what lay ahead, but it no longer mattered. He was a part of this place, a part of something that surpassed his understanding. Ivan stood on the threshold of a new world, surveying the vast expanses that stretched before him. This was not a place that could be inscribed in the usual coordinates of time and space. There was no horizon, no end, only an endless nebula stretching in all directions. The ground felt soft under his feet, as if he were walking on clouds, but that did not calm him. He could not feel safe here, where reality and illusion intertwined. The feeling that he had lost everything that had once been familiar to him turned into a deep anxiety. Everything he knew had disappeared. He could not remember when or how he had become a part of this endless darkness. And even if it had been his choice, this choice now seemed to him a very distant illusion. "What is this place?" he asked himself quietly. His voice echoed as if he were speaking into the void, and there was no response. There was no sound, no answer. Only silence. The figure appeared before him again. It was familiar, yet vague, its silhouette blurred, like part of a shadow that could not be caught. It was the same voice, the same gaze that he had felt in the mirror, in the shadow behind the door. Now he knew that it was a part of him, a part of his own wandering in an endless labyrinth. "You are no longer in that world, Ivan," the figure said. Its voice sounded just as blurred, but this time Ivan felt his body tighten with anxiety. "This is your place. You created it. And now it is yours." Ivan did not answer. He simply stared at the figure, not knowing what to say. All his questions remained unanswered, and it created a feeling of hopelessness. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. The figure moved closer to him, and her face became a little clearer, but it still looked unnatural, as if the very features were dissolving in the darkness. Her eyes were shining, and it was the only thing that seemed real in this world. But these eyes were not kind. They were not even human. They were something more like glimpses of a universal essence that was watching him. "You paid your price for becoming a part of this world," the figure said. "You have changed, and now your ways will not be the same as before." Ivan felt a cold sweat cover his body. His body no longer obeyed him, and it seemed that every cell was empty. It became difficult for him to breathe. Everything around him mixed like a fog that absorbs and does not let go. This space had no boundaries, and he no longer had any control over himself. "I don't want to be a part of this," he said quietly, although he himself understood that it no longer mattered. He was no longer in the world where choice could make a difference. The figure took a step back, again dragging everything around him into darkness. Her voice became even more hazy. "You can't go back. You can't run away. You chose your path, Ivan. And now you are a part of this place. A part of this endless, dark cycle." Ivan began to feel his consciousness gradually dissolving in this place. All that remained was only emptiness and its echoes. He no longer remembered the last time he had felt alive. Now he was a part of this space, a part of the darkness that had no boundaries. His body was no longer his, but simply dissolved in this abyss. He took a step forward and felt himself crossing the threshold again. A new cycle, a new path. This path had no beginning, and it had no end. Ivan stepped forward, and with each step he felt the darkness engulfing him more and more. He was not sure if he was still a man, or if it was only his memories that remained what had once been called life. His body no longer obeyed him, but moved as if it were a part of this world that had become an endless void. There was nothing around him, no walls, no sky, only an endless nebula that squeezed him from all sides. The shadow that followed him became even clearer, and he felt it approaching. It was not just a figure. It was the very essence of this world. Its eyes, radiating cold light, were inextricably attached to him. "You still don't understand, Ivan," the voice was the same as before, dull, emotionless, but now there was some incomprehensible anxiety in it. "You chose this path. And now this is your reality. There is no going back. You have disappeared from that world, and you no longer exist in it." Ivan looked into her eyes, which reflected the abyss of this world. They had neither compassion nor cruelty, only a cold dispassion. "I don't want this," he whispered, although he was no longer sure whether he had the right to want it. "I don't want to stay here." The shadow slowly approached, and her face blurred, as if dissolving in the darkness. She approached him, and now he felt her presence literally in every cell of his body. "There is no here or there," she said. "There is only what you create. This place is a part of you, Ivan. You created it, and now you are a part of it." Ivan lowered his head, his body becoming heavy with this realization. All his attempts to escape from this world felt hopelessly futile. His free will melted into a fog, and those dreams of returning to reality became ghosts following him. He felt reality disappearing, and instead appeared an endless darkness in which there was neither time nor space. "I do not want to be this," he repeated, like a curse, but he no longer believed his words. The shadow took a step back, and everything around began to blur. There was nothing but a dark void. "The choice has been made," she said, her voice now sounding emotionless, like a fact. "You are already a part of this world. You will exist in it as I exist. As each of us." Ivan could no longer fight this creature. All his attempts to escape or find a way out seemed ridiculous and weak. He took a step into the void, and his body dissolved into darkness. What was left of him? Only a face, blurred and featureless, that could no longer dream or yearn for anything. Ivan, no longer a man, but not quite a being of this world, had become part of the endless darkness. There was no longer any sense of time or space in his consciousness. Now he had become invisible, like all those who entered this world. They were not alive, they were not dead. They were parts of something greater, something that could not be recognized, could not be explained. There was no longer any room in the darkness for pity or fear. Ivan simply was. And with each second he felt his presence being erased, becoming part of this world that had no end. And so they all remained, eternal, disembodied shadows, wandering without purpose, without memories, without desires. Time no longer mattered here. It was flowing into an endless sea of darkness, where all the boundaries that had once existed ceased to be important. Ivan no longer felt like a person, but he could not understand who he had become. He was everything and nothing at the same time. Darkness enveloped him, filling every corner of his consciousness. The feelings of the burdens of the past were losing their power, and even memory began to melt away like fog at dawn. His heart no longer beat in his chest. Instead, there was an emptiness, like a deep gorge that swallowed everything. He no longer looked for an answer to the question what happened, because he had long understood, there are no questions, no answers here, there is only an endless cycle that has neither beginning nor end. But, something had changed. In the embrace of this boundless silence and darkness, he suddenly felt that he was not alone. Something was moving nearby. Something else, just as faceless, but with some deep, incomprehensible intention. It was another presence, another shadow, wandering in this emptiness. Ivan tried to feel if it was just his imagination, if something or someone was really approaching him. "You are not alone, Ivan." The voice was quiet, but it seemed to penetrate directly into his consciousness, leaving no chance for denial. Ivan froze, his mind swallowing these words, trying to understand their meaning. He tried to recognize the source of this voice, but the darkness did not allow him to even make out his own thoughts. "You will still stay here, part of this place, part of me." The voice became clearer, as if it was no longer one of the many echoes of this world. It was not quite alive, but not quite dead either. Ivan realized that it was not just his imagination. It wasn't just another shadow, it was a voice that belonged to the very essence of this world. It was a voice that came from the very core of this endless darkness. "What do you want from me?" Ivan spoke these words, although he didn't expect any answer. All his words were now as ghostly as the thoughts themselves. "I want you to understand, Ivan. You didn't choose this path by chance. You're not just wandering in this world. You're part of it. And you no longer have the opportunity to choose." The voice sounded as if from every corner of the darkness at once. Ivan felt these words, like a magnet, sucking him into themselves. There was no escape from this new reality that was crashing down on him. Whether it was a punishment or simply the law of this world he didn't know. But he felt that his time in this place was already fixed, and his every movement or thought became part of the endless flow of this dark existence. The darkness around him began to change. It was no longer just a night void. It began to manifest shapes that could be called shadows, but they had no definite outlines. They were alive even if that wasn't quite the right word. They were more like vague memories or blurred images that flowed from the abyss of this world. Ivan tried not to look at these shapes. But they were everywhere. And the more he tried to ignore them, the clearer they became. You will still have a role in this world, the voice returned again, but now it had a certain ominous calm. You will watch, and be a part of it. You are the only thing left of the past world. Ivan couldn't help but look. He looked at the shapes that moved around him. They were infinitely elongated, faceless and shapeless. But he felt their gaze. They looked at him like the stars that had once lit the sky, but now they were part of this darkness. He felt like he had become a part of them. His consciousness was contracting, his body was no longer obeying him, and he was no longer the Ivan who had once struggled, searching for answers. Now he was a part of this world. He had become only an echo that had lost touch with reality, but had become part of something much larger. This world, this endless labyrinth of darkness, had now become his home. And he realized that there was no longer any room for struggle in it. Ivan felt the darkness around him shrink. It was not just the absence of light, but something alive, something that experienced every second, every movement with him. He had no physical body, but he still felt every breath of this boundless emptiness. The shadows that moved around him had no form, but their presence was real, and their every movement seemed familiar to him. Suddenly, an image appeared before him, not clear, but quite vivid. It was a picture of his old home, a place he had left many years ago. His mother was sitting in an old wooden chair, her head slightly tilted, just as he remembered her before all this began. She was looking into the void, her eyes the same shade as the shadows around her. "Mom!" Ivan whispered, his voice echoing in this emptiness. But there was no answer. Only the echo of his own words, disintegrating in the fog. He tried to get closer, but he felt that the closer he got, the more the image blurred, turning into fog. Again the darkness swallowed him, and there was nothing before him. Only this boundless emptiness, in which there was neither hope nor a way back. Suddenly he heard the same voice again, touching his mind. "You want to return. But do you really want this?" The voice sounded calm, but there was irony in it, leaving him no room for doubt. Ivan did not answer. His thoughts, like everything around him, were blurring, but in the depths of his soul there remained a struggle. He was not yet able to completely surrender to this darkness. He still remembered the warm moments he had once had, his desire for something greater. "I want to get out. I want to go back, home," he muttered, though he wasn't sure he believed his words. He felt the darkness tighten around him again, wrapping itself around him. It was like self-determination, a choice, but without a choice. His words dissipated in this emptiness, like the last flashes of light before they disappeared. "There's no going back. You're here, Ivan. And you'll stay." His hands, no longer material, became heavy as stones. Every movement felt incredibly complex, and with each new breath the darkness grew thicker. Then Ivan realized that he wasn't the only one who had fallen into this world. Several other forms, formless, like giant imprints of the past, began to appear around him. They looked like his own reflection, but not quite. They also had no contours, but they felt like part of this dark substance. He couldn't say how many there were, but he felt that the number was indeterminately large. Are you here too?" he whispered, although he knew the answer. One of the forms slowly approached him, and although its face could not be seen, he felt its gaze, cold and merciless. "We are all here, Ivan. You are not alone. We have become part of this world. We are its echoes, its shadows." Ivan involuntarily took a step back. He was surrounded, and every step he took brought no relief. It was not a movement forward, but simply a walk into the void. This world had no boundaries, and everything he did became part of an endless circle that never ended. The shadow came closer still. "You cannot open the door. All doors lead only back, and you will find no way out." Ivan froze. He felt himself increasingly trapped in this world, feeling his very essence dissolving in the darkness. The creature's words were true, he could not go back. He could not return to the world he had left behind, and now there was nothing left to bind him. Ivan closed his eyes, and for a moment it seemed to him that he was home. He heard familiar sounds, smells. But when he opened his eyes again, the darkness was here again, and he was a part of it again. He understood one simple thing: he was not the only one wandering here. He was part of the endless history of this world, its traveler who had no end. Ivan no longer tried to escape. He simply stood there, and his shadows became more and more real. The shadow of this world was no longer his shadow, it had become him. Ivan felt his consciousness sinking deeper into this world, dark, boundless, without time and space. His movements became more and more mechanical, as if he no longer had the strength to make decisions on his own. He was only a reflection of what was happening around him. The feeling of losing his identity was gradually becoming the norm. The shadow that was next to him did not leave. It remained, feeling like a part of him, like a bitter truth penetrating deep into the soul. Ivan could no longer say whether it was his shadow or the shadow of this place, but he felt that they had become one. The darkness inside him and outside him merged. That voice appeared again, familiar, but even more tangible. "You understand now, Ivan." The voice sounded calm, without any threat, but also without sympathy. "You are no longer who you were. You have become part of this place. And, like all of us, you will not be able to escape from it." Ivan closed his eyes, trying not to listen. He did not want to hear any more, did not want to accept this reality. But the voice continued to sound, touching his consciousness again and again. "You are one of us, Ivan. You have found yourself in this place, in this shadow. You can no longer come out into the light, because you are part of its darkness." The shadow in front of him began to gradually take shape. It was not a specific shape, but it was definite. It was a face, blurred and indistinct, but with some vague feature that Ivan could recognize, if he still had the ability to recognize. "This is not a punishment, Ivan. This is a transformation. You have become what you have always been deep down." Ivan stood there, completely unsure of how to react. What do you do when you are told that you are no longer who you were? What do you do when you realize you can't go back to who you were? What do you do when your reality has long since become nothing more than a shadow of your former life? He tried to move, but every step was held back by this presence, this new entity that had become a part of him. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something much more than just darkness. It was all that was left of those who had come before him, and those who would come after. He was no longer just an observer. He had become one of them. "You will observe the world, Ivan. And you will be a part of it, even as it changes." Ivan understood. This was more than just his new existence. He was part of this world that existed between worlds. He was like these shadows, like these shapes that moved around him. He had become not only an echo of this place, but a living part of it. Another voice, one of the other echoes, reached him. "We are here to save this world. We are here to be a part of it." These words did not cause Ivan to despair, but they did not give him peace either. They simply became another part of his new reality. He was in this world, and now there was no way to go back. Ivan felt his own thoughts merging more and more with the voices around him. They were not just voices. They were parts of this world, its fabric that connected all realities. His thoughts, his memories, his self, all this was disappearing in this endless stream. The darkness became not just a place. It became a state of existence in which there was no longer anything that could bring an end. All exits were blocked. Ivan became part of this infinite reality that existed outside of time and space. Ivan felt the darkness engulf his every movement, his every thought. He no longer tried to fight it. There was no point in looking for a way out when all paths led only to this boundless emptiness. His mind was forced to adapt to a new reality where there was neither time nor space, but only darkness that encompassed everything around. He saw other forms, as formless as himself. They were around him, but they showed no aggression. Their movements were calm, as if they simply existed in this world, not trying to change it, not trying to escape from it. They were not alive, but not dead either. They were something in between, what Ivan himself had become. Shadows that had become part of this place. The same question he had heard before, when he was still conscious, was heard again. Do you understand, Ivan? This voice was familiar, but no longer as scary as before. He no longer caused anxiety. It was simply the voice of a part of this place, a voice merging with his own thoughts. You are no longer who you were. You cannot go back. Ivan did not answer. There are no words to express what happens to you when you become part of something bigger than yourself. He understood that he could not go back. But he did not want to. He no longer looked for a way out. He had become part of this endless darkness, part of something that was as old as reality itself. His thoughts and shadows merged with others, creating an endless network where every movement and every thought became one great being that existed outside of time and space. Ivan began to realize that there was no single way out of this place. Everyone who came here became part of it. This was not a catastrophe, this was a transformation. Ivan was no longer a separate person. He became part of what had always been. He was part of this darkness, and it was part of him. The same form that had been beside him reappeared, vague but still palpable. It moved slowly, like a feather falling from a tree. It was not a threat, but it felt like more than just a presence. We are here to sustain this world, Ivan. And you are one of us now. Stay with us. Ivan felt the words sink into his consciousness. They were not an order. They were simply a statement. He was no longer able to fight, no longer able to think differently. The darkness had become his only reality, and he no longer sought another. He did not want to seek another. His body became hazy, blurred. He no longer felt pain, no longer felt weight. He was all that this darkness was. And in this darkness he found peace. Peace not from having overcome fear, but from having understood, there was no more struggle here. There was no more life here, no more death. There was only an infinite presence here, taking you in, changing you, turning you into a part of itself. Ivan was not alone. He was not separate. He was one of many. And this boundless world was no longer scary to him. It had become his home. And although he could not return to who he had been, Ivan realized that it did not matter. All those who were here had become his family, had become a part of him. Now that time no longer mattered, when space had become only an echo of his thoughts, Ivan felt himself begin to dissolve into the darkness again. And he did not try to stop. He simply merged with this shadow, accepting his new essence. And this world was no longer alien to him. This was his world. His infinite world. Time passed, and it seemed that for Ivan there was no longer a boundary between the world of the living and the shadows that existed on its borders. He had become a part of everything that was in this place, and everything that had come before seemed a distant memory. Perhaps he had once been human, perhaps he had once had dreams and desires, but now, in this boundless darkness, all of that seemed to have been long forgotten. But even here, in the midst of this infinite space, Ivan sometimes felt an importance. Not the importance of himself, but something that went beyond individuality. It was the importance of being, the importance of existing in this state. And although he could not say exactly what it was, he felt it in every breath, in every wave that passed through him. Sometimes he met others who had also become a part of this reality. They did not look like he had once seen the living. Their forms were indistinct, but he felt the same state, they too had become a part of this infinite darkness. Ivan saw them, but he no longer felt the need to communicate. They existed silently side by side, like shadows gliding past each other, leaving no trace in time. Strangely enough, Ivan sometimes saw memories of the times when he was still alive. He saw fragments of his former life, old photographs, dusty books, and even empty rooms that bore the traces of past inhabitants. These memories were not painful, they were not a burden. They were simply part of this world, this endless stream of realities that existed simultaneously. And then one day he felt one of the shadows approach him. She did not speak, but Ivan felt her presence more clearly than ever before. It was not just a shadow, not just a reflection of something, it was a consciousness that existed next to him. "Do you still remember?" the shadow asked, and its voice was familiar. It was the same voice he had heard before, when he had first come here. Ivan felt his consciousness recall those old moments when he had been alive. Those moments seemed so distant, so insignificant now. His mind was no longer able to attach them to himself, but he felt them deep inside. "I remember, but it doesn't matter anymore," Ivan replied, although he was not sure that the words were his own. They sounded like an echo of what he had once been, like an echo of who he had been before. The shadow fell silent, as if contemplating his words. Ivan felt himself merging with the darkness again, his consciousness becoming part of this infinite space. He was here, in this place, and now had no beginning or end. He had become one of those who neither die nor live. And yet, in the midst of this deep darkness, Ivan felt peace. All his fears, all his desires had disappeared. He was no longer alone. He was part of something greater, something that had existed from the beginning and would exist until the end. And perhaps that was his purpose. The darkness was no longer scary. It had become a home. Ivan had become part of that home. The end.